There is a moment, and if you've lived it, you recognize it immediately, where something inside you stops waiting for permission to exist. No announcement, no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden revelation that changes everything in an instant. Just a shift, quiet, irreversible. Like a door closing behind you that you didn't even realize you had walked through. One day you are the person who rehearses conversations before having them, who reads the temperature of every room before deciding how much of yourself is safe to bring in, who absorbs everyone's unspoken tension like it's your job, because somewhere along the way you decided it was, who gives until empty, and then somehow locates a reserve you didn't know existed and gives from that too. And then, without ceremony, without fanfare, you're not that person anymore. Carl Jung spent the better part of his clinical career trying to understand what actually happens inside the psychology of someone who crosses this line. Not the line between broken and healed, a different line entirely. The one between someone whose sensitivity makes them available to everyone and someone whose sensitivity makes them available only on their own terms. Between someone the world can move at will and someone the world simply cannot get purchase on, no matter how hard it tries. What he found wasn't what most people expect when they imagine becoming stronger. It wasn't about feeling less. It wasn't about building higher walls or developing a thicker skin or mastering the art of not caring. It was about something far more radical, far more complete, and far more permanent than any of those things. It was about a transformation so total that the person who comes out the other side isn't a stronger version of the person who went in. They're a different order of person entirely. Most people who identify as empaths carry a particular kind of exhaustion that is difficult to explain to someone who doesn't share it. It isn't the exhaustion of working too hard, though that's often present. It's the exhaustion of living without a membrane between yourself and the emotional reality of everyone around you. Other people's moods become your moods without your consent. Other people's problems develop a gravitational pull that reorganizes your entire day. Other people's unspoken suffering sits in your chest like something you swallowed accidentally and cannot digest. And the cruelest part of it is that you're exceptional at it. Your ability to read people, to sense what's underneath what someone is saying, to feel the shift in a room before anyone else has registered that something changed. These aren't small things. They are genuinely rare, but the world, rather than treating them as gifts, tends to treat them as an available resource, as a service, as a reason to bring you their heaviest things and leave them there. Jung noticed something specific about empaths who reached a certain breaking point, not the kind that breaks a person into pieces, the other kind, the kind that breaks the pattern that was breaking them. These individuals didn't become unstoppable by acquiring something new. They became unstoppable by losing something old. Something they had been carrying for so long, in such an intimate way, that they had stopped being able to tell where it ended and where they began. Understanding what that something is that is the entire architecture of this transformation. To understand where the empath arrives, you have to understand where they've been. Jung traced a progression through the psychology of sensitive people, and it maps so precisely onto lived experience that most empaths, hearing it described, feel the specific weight of recognition that comes with finally being seen accurately. The first phase is one of invisible drowning. The empath in this phase doesn't yet have a name for what they are. They only know that life carries a different weight for them than it appears to for everyone else. They move through environments that other people navigate without difficulty and arrive on the other side depleted in ways they cannot explain. They cry at things others shrug off. They feel responsible for emotional atmospheres they didn't create and couldn't control. And because no one around them has language for what's happening, the only available conclusion is that something is fundamentally wrong with them. Too sensitive, too emotional, too much of everything that the world seems to prefer you be less of. This phase can last years. For some people it lasts a lifetime. The second phase is recognition. The empath finds language for their experience. They discover that what they've been living has a name, that other people share it, that there are frameworks and communities and entire bodies of knowledge organized around exactly what they've been going through. And this recognition is genuinely healing. It is not a small thing to finally have words for something you've only felt. For a time, the recognition itself feels like the destination. But Jung identified a shadow embedded in this phase that most people miss entirely because they are too relieved to have arrived in it to examine it closely. The moment you build an identity around being an empath, you have exchanged one kind of cage for another, a more comfortable one, a more articulate one that comes with community and vocabulary and a sense of purpose, but a cage nonetheless. Because now your entire psychological life is organized around a story about sensitivity as wound. You are the one who absorbs, the one who heals, the one who has been hurt by people who couldn't feel what you feel. The wound isn't just something that happened to you anymore. It has become the center of gravity around which your entire sense of self orbits. The third phase is attempted boundary setting. This is where the majority of empaths are living right now. They are doing the work. They are saying no. They are pulling back from relationships that drain them. They are in therapy, in journals, in workshops, in communities of people who understand. They have more self-awareness than most people will develop in an entire lifetime. And yet, and this is the part that creates a particular quiet desperation in people who are living it, the work never seems to finish. The same patterns resurface wearing different faces. The boundaries get set and then collapse. The healing journey becomes its own permanent identity. There is always another layer, always another thing to process, always a sense of being perpetually in recovery, perpetually almost there, but never quite arriving. Jung identified with exact precision why this happens. And it is not, as most people assume, a problem of effort or awareness or commitment to the work. The reason the loop doesn't resolve is because the self that is doing the healing is still the wounded self. This is the thing most people are not willing to look at directly. You can accumulate years of insight about your patterns and still be running those patterns because the one accumulating the insight is organized around the wound that created them. You can set boundaries every day and still find them collapsing because the one setting them is still, at the foundational level, the person who learned that their worth was conditional and their needs were negotiable. Healing, in this framework, becomes another extension of the wound identity. You are not transcending the wound. You are building an increasingly sophisticated life around it. Jung called this the ego's most elegant trap, its ability to make even growth into a strategy for staying exactly the same. What he observed in empaths who finally broke through this ceiling was not that they healed more completely. It was that they underwent something that looks from the outside like a kind of psychological death. The wound identity, not just the wound, but the entire self that had been constructed around it, had to dissolve. Completely, not mostly. Not to the degree that felt safe and manageable. Completely. And the thing that makes this so difficult, the reason most empaths approach it and then retreat, is what comes immediately after that dissolution. Nothing. Not peace, not clarity. Not the relief you might expect after finally putting down something that heavy. Just an open, formless, genuinely terrifying emptiness. The old self is gone. The new self hasn't formed. For a stretch of time that feels much longer than it actually is, you are nobody. No story to locate yourself in. No wound to organize around. No healing journey to give your days direction and purpose. No role in the world that feels true. Jung documented this void with precision because he watched person after person arrive at its edge and turn back. Not because they were weak, because the emptiness was real and the wounded identity, for all its limitations, had been familiar. It had offered belonging and meaning and a way of understanding yourself in relation to other people. The void offers none of that, so people retreat. They return to the healing loop, to the familiar territory of being the sensitive one who is working on themselves. And they tell themselves that this return is wisdom, that they weren't ready, that they need more preparation before they can go further. And sometimes this is true. But more often it is the wound identity protecting itself, because identity, even painful identity, is fiercely self-preserving. The empaths Jung observed, who stayed in the void, who tolerated the emptiness without reaching for the old story to fill it, who remained nobody long enough for something genuine to form, what emerged from that process was not what anyone predicted, including Jung himself, at least initially. It wasn't a healed version of the person who entered. It was someone whose entire relationship with their own sensitivity had inverted. Everything that had once been a source of suffering had become a source of a completely different kind of power. The perception that used to leave them drowning in other people's unprocessed emotions became something Jung described as clean seeing. When your own unhealed wounds are active, they function like a distorting lens on everything you perceive. You don't see people clearly. You see your history reflected back at you through them. You see your abandonment wound in situations that have nothing to do with abandonment. You see your unworthiness narrative confirmed in interactions that were actually neutral. When the wound identity dissolves and the perception is no longer filtered through all of that accumulated pain, what remains is the ability to see what is actually there. Not what you fear is there, not what your history has trained you to expect, what is actually precisely demonstrably there. This made these empaths nearly impossible to deceive, not because they would become suspicious or cynical, but because their perception, no longer contaminated by their own projections, was simply accurate in a way that most people's perception never becomes. Manipulation registers as data rather than as an emotional hook. Dishonesty is visible before it has finished presenting itself. The performance people offer in place of their actual interior state is transparent in a way that, once you can see it, you cannot unsee. The empathy itself remained completely intact, sharpened actually, but it changed character entirely. Where it had once compelled pulling the empath into rescuing and fixing and absorbing whether they chose to or not, it became elective. They could feel someone's pain with complete fidelity and remain entirely themselves in the feeling. They could witness suffering without being consumed by the need to end it. The difference between being pulled underwater by someone who is drowning and choosing to swim toward them, that is the difference. Same water, entirely different relationship to it. And then there was the quality that surprised people most. Jung called it integrated ferocity. Empaths, particularly in the earlier phases, tend to have a very troubled relationship with their own anger. They have been taught, often explicitly, that their sensitivity is supposed to express itself as gentleness, as understanding, as compassion. Anger feels like a violation of what they're supposed to be, so they suppress it, redirect it, apologize for it when it surfaces, and ultimately turn it back on themselves, where it becomes something much darker and more damaging than it ever would have been if expressed cleanly. The empath who has passed through ego death has claimed their anger as their own, not the reactive, wounded anger of someone who has been repeatedly hurt and is finally exploding. Something cleaner than that, more precise. The capacity to be devastatingly direct when the moment calls for it. To say the single sentence that cuts through years of someone's self-deception with such accuracy that there is nowhere left to hide from it. Not cruel, not aggressive. Just so precisely aimed that it lands without the possibility of deflection. People who knew the earlier version of this person don't quite know how to categorize what they're encountering now. The warmth is still present, the care is still genuine, but there is a gravity to them, a quality of presence that communicates something without words, that you would be wasting your time performing for this person, that the only thing that will work here is reality. Jung noted something specific about how this presence registers on other people, particularly on those accustomed to managing empaths through emotional manipulation. The entire toolkit stops working. Guilt trips find nothing to attach to. Appeals to the empath's compassion land without producing the expected compliance. Attempts to destabilize their perception of reality meet a certainty that is quiet but absolute. The infrastructure that made the empath manageable, the approval hunger, the abandonment sensitivity, the guilt mechanisms, has been dismantled, not through willpower, not through determined boundary setting, through the death of the self that contained it. What remains, on the other side of that dissolution, is someone who operates from a place that most people spend their entire lives trying to reach through effort and never quite arriving at. Their emotional state belongs to them in a way that is so fundamental, it's almost difficult to describe. They walk into a room full of grief and feel the grief without becoming it. They encounter someone's rage and perceive it completely without absorbing a molecule of it into their own system. They can choose to share in someone's emotional experience fully and genuinely, and then return to themselves with nothing missing. Jung considered this emotional sovereignty the state in which your internal reality originates from within you rather than being continuously rewritten by external conditions to be among the clearest possible markers that someone had completed this transformation. Because from that sovereignty, everything else in a person's life reorganizes. Relationships become cleaner because you are choosing to be in them rather than being pulled by the emotional gravity of the other person's needs. Work becomes more focused because you are no longer constantly processing the psychic atmosphere of everyone around you. Life becomes quieter inside, even when it remains loud outside. If you are somewhere in the middle of this, somewhere in the loop that feels like growth but keeps returning you to the same place, there is something worth sitting with honestly. You are not one more insight away from the shift. You are not failing because your boundaries don't hold or because the patterns keep repeating. You are at a threshold that knowledge cannot carry you across and effort cannot force. The wound was real. Everything that happened to you was real. The pain was not imagined and does not require minimizing. But there is a difference between something that happened to you and something that you have become. And the moment you are willing to examine whether the second thing is actually you, or whether it is a structure built by circumstances that you have been maintaining out of familiarity, is the moment the door to the final stage becomes visible. What comes through that door is not a person who cannot be hurt. It is a person who can be hurt completely and remain themselves through the hurting. Not a person who has transcended feeling. A person who feels everything and loses nothing of themselves in the feeling. Not someone who has placed themselves beyond the reach of life. Someone who has finally become present enough to meet life exactly as it is, with every layer of their sensitivity fully active, and not one layer of it available to be used against them. That is what unstoppable means, not invulnerability, totality. The complete inhabiting of everything you are, with nothing left over that anyone else can use to move you from yourself. Jung saw this emerge, again and again, in people who were willing to go all the way through the void rather than around it. Every time, without exception, what came out the other side was someone who had finally, completely, without remainder, arrived at themselves. There is no defense against that person, because there is nothing left to defend against.